Hello everyone, and welcome to a special edition of AMMA's Q&A Info Exchange webinar as we prepare for the implications of the COVID-19 vaccine across Australia. The COVID-19 vaccine is a critical area to ensure resources and energy employers can continue to provide safe and healthy workplaces. For those that haven't met me, I'm Tara Diamond and I'm the Director of Operations at AMMA, and I'm pleased to be joined by our Head of West Coast, Ben O'Brien. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks, Tara.
Before we get started, I wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which I am initiating this webinar from, the Turrbal people, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. This is our first webinar for 2020 and I'd like to welcome all of you back for another year. I hope you got to have a much needed break over the festive season. But thank you once again for your support and engagement with AMMA. I don't know who Emma is, that was on top of my mind, but it's great to see so many familiar faces on today's webinar list. And for the format, we've got 30 minutes to discuss the workplace policy and workforce implications of the COVID-19 vaccine. And as the no jab, no work policy discussion continues amongst the entire employer community, we suggest that it'll become one of the most significant employment law issues of 2021. As always in these webinars, please pop your questions in the question box in your user panel. Put them through those questions or comments you might have in that box at any time, and I'll get to as many questions as I can through the webinar as the moderator. And thank you to those of you that have already sent through some questions we received earlier in the week, and we'll definitely get to those. We'll get things started with Ben giving an overview of the vaccine and what it means for workplace policy. And Ben, before we get into specifics, can you give an overview of the latest updates on the vaccine and where the rollout is as it relates to workforce?
Yeah, thanks, Tara. I think, well, everyone's probably aware that quite a bit has been written about the workforce and workplace implications of the COVID-19 vaccine. But I think to put the issue in context, it's important that everyone understands what the government timetable is for rolling out access to the vaccine. The government has announced that there's no firm timetable in place yet, but the expectation is that the first vaccines will become available potentially in March. And then the government is working through a staged rollout of the vaccine to certain identified high-risk groups in the community in the first instance. So the first phase 1A, is directed at providing the vaccine to quarantine and border workers, frontline healthcare and aged care workers, and that's about 1.4 million doses of the vaccine. And then phase 1B, which is kind of a significantly bigger group of people, that includes the elderly, other healthcare workers, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and other critical and high-risk workers like police, defence and emergency services. And that's a further 14.8 million doses of the vaccine. So that's a fairly significant tract of people in Australia who will be given priority access to the vaccine in the first instance. And given that the government is working to, or it set itself a target of delivering about 1 million doses of the vaccine per week, you're really looking at moving through those first two phases through to about mid-June of this year. And it's not until after that point that the vaccine is going to be made available for older adults, so people over the age of 50, and other critical and high-risk workers. And that's the group of people in which we expect to find some resources roles finding themselves getting some access to the vaccine at that point. So I think understanding that the vaccine may not actually be available in the resources industry until maybe mid-June at the earliest is a good way of putting into context the circumstance of the vaccine and the type of time that people have available to them to get their ducks in a row in relation to say workplace policies and how they propose to address this in the workplace. So one of the other things that I think is important to note is that the government has announced that it won't be making the vaccine mandatory for people, which of course I think has swung the conversation around to the ability of employers to require their employees to be vaccinated in order to attend for work at the workplace. And that's, I think, the central issue in play at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's get on to that. And we know the resources sector has been so successful with a range of, COVID-19 mitigation strategies through COVID safe plans to date, building on our industry's really strong WHS practices. But let's get into those specific considerations. And thanks to a couple of people that have popped some questions in. And so, Ben, broadly from a policy and legislative perspective, what is AMMA's current position in terms of advice for its members around the rollout of the vaccine in relation to their workforce?
So our position on this is that in the first instance, and I think the key takeaway from today for everyone is don't rush to print with a workplace policy that is a one-size-fits-all to the question of the vaccine. It is probably very tempting for simplicity's sake to adopt a position that every person in every role in your company must be vaccinated in order to do their job, but that actually may not be the case. So rather than kind of running ahead and taking that position and incurring all of the problematic issues that will likely arise from taking that position, I think the better course of action is to actually just approach this in a methodical way, understand the risk profiles of the various roles in your organisation, and use that understanding to make an informed decision about whether roles actually do or don't require a vaccination in order to be performed. The assessment is something that has to be done on a case-by-case basis. It's not something that you can just take a blanket approach on. So that's from our perspective, that's the key takeaway from today, is to not take that kind of one-size-fits-all approach to a workplace policy on this. That's not to say that you don't end up in a position where you're saying that everyone in your organisation needs to take the vaccine. But in order to get that point, there's some important groundwork that people should be doing ahead of time in order to make their end position more defensible. Great.
Thanks, Ben. We've just had a question come in from Mike Spencer, which I think is really important context to what you've just discussed. We've definitely got an update on this for Mike and for everyone. It says, Ben, what if airlines say no jab, no seat? Will that mean that FIFO employees move up to the top of the list? Or move up the list is what Mike specifically asked.
Yeah, I think that would certainly be the case. Our understanding from some high-level discussions with the aviation industry is that they don't have any plans to make vaccinations a requirement for domestic travel in Australia. That's our understanding at the moment. But certainly, if that position changed and there was a requirement that you need to have evidence of having been vaccinated in order to get on a flight, or alternatively, if a state or a territory government took the position that you can only enter the state if you have had the vaccine, that I think would certainly bump the resources industry and its kind of large contingent of FIFO employees would certainly bump them up the priority list.
And further to that question, Mike, and your answer, Ben, of course, there's the international no jab, no travel policies that Qantas in particular has indicated, and a lot of our members here have people that do move internationally to undertake their roles in expatriate positions. We haven't had guidance. In fact, we were just on the phone to the Resources Minister's office just minutes before the webinar, and we haven't had any indication of how that kind of private policy from an airline perspective will affect the prioritisation of the vaccine rollout. But we're onto it and we'll keep you updated. So that probably brings me to another question that has been posed by many of our members, Ben, in the last couple of weeks, which is people are putting together their policies. And what are the considerations, the really key considerations that AMMA members need to keep in mind as they look to develop and implement any COVID-19 vaccine policies?
So before committing to something in writing about what your organisation's position is in relation to the vaccine. I think the best way to think about it is this is really a kind of funneling down process that everyone's involved in at the moment. With the government's rollout of the vaccine, you are going to see a large number of people vaccinated on a voluntary basis. And then you'll also have, potentially have some people in your workforce who, for one reason or another, are actually not able to take the vaccine, and that may be for an underlying medical condition or something of that nature. So you really, I think, need to focus on funneling down to the group of people who we probably all understand exist to a certain extent in all workplaces, of people who, for some unknown reason, just flat out refuse to take the vaccine. And it's really a question of how you're going to deal with that situation if and when it arises. And that's probably not something that's going to come to the fore in the near term. If you think about the timetable that the government's working to, this might be something that you only really start to tackle towards the end of this year. But I think focusing on how you propose to address that particular situation will help you to frame up an appropriate workplace policy for your organisation. And when you think about how you're going to address that issue of somebody who is flat out refusing to be vaccinated against COVID-19, if you are going to, or if you want to take the position that the person must be vaccinated, it's an inherent requirement of their role that they are vaccinated against this disease, you are mostly going to be relying on your obligations under workplace health and safety laws in order to maintain that position. So under the harmonised WHS laws around Australia, employers have a general duty to eliminate or minimise workplace risks as far as reasonably practicable. And if you consider that an unacceptable workplace risk arises if an unvaccinated person attends the workplace, that's when you're in the conversation about making that direction to somebody that they cannot attend work unless they've had the vaccine, and that's the no jab, no job situation that arises. Now, our view is that there likely will be many such roles in your organisations where you'll be able to direct people to be vaccinated. But in order to get to that position, you do need to understand the unique risk profile of that person's specific role. And that's why we're saying this is not a one-size-fits-all answer to the vaccine issue. You really do need to understand the specific risks that attach to that particular individual's role. So, for example, the risks that attach to a FIFO role are likely going to be much different to those that attach to somebody who works in your corporate head office. A FIFO employee is going to be required to travel through airports, travel on planes, live and work in close proximity to others from all around Australia. That's a very different risk profile to the person who's working maybe in an open plan office and sharing kitchen and bathroom facilities with maybe a smaller group of people. That's not to say that FIFO employees are more at risk than people who are working in your head office. That may not be the case at all. They're probably equally at risk. But I think it's important to address the direction of, if you want to direct somebody to be vaccinated, you need to do it on the basis of the risks that actually attach to that person's role, rather than some general high-level COVID is dangerous for everyone type of approach. And that is a much more defensible position to be in if you do find yourself in a difficult scenario facing a unfair dismissal claim, a general protections claim, or a discrimination action.
Thanks, Ben. In fact, we've got a couple of questions that have arisen out of that question. So I'll just jump to one of them, which is from Drew, and it says, Ben, can you comment on the strength of the lawful and reasonable direction argument, given we know the vaccine does not prevent transmission and side effects are largely untested?
Yeah, and I think this is another reason why people shouldn't be rushing into taking a position that everyone needs to be vaccinated. There's still quite a bit that needs to be understood about the vaccine, its efficacy, any, I suppose, other issues that may or may not arise that we just aren't aware of yet. So it's for that reason that I think there are other good reasons why it's probably worth just taking your time and getting to the point of taking a position on this. And what we do understand about the vaccine is that even if you're vaccinated, you potentially can still transmit the virus. And if you think about what that may look like in the community more broadly in about 12 months' time, where there's likely going to be a large number of people that have been vaccinated, we may start to see border controls being more relaxed. I think that does actually, or it may, raise the risk profile for everyone else who has not been vaccinated. And it's at that point where you may start to take a stronger position on requiring people to be vaccinated. So the stance that you have today is likely going to evolve over time as the vaccine rollout continues and as other issues start to come to the fore. And yep, you probably are going to have to confront some people saying, well, you want me to take the AstraZeneca vaccine that's proven to only be 60% effective. Is that really an effective way of minimising this particular workplace risk? Look, at this point, with no other options available to us, I'd say that it is an effective way of minimising that risk. But that position may be different in 12 months' time.
Okay, I've just been scribbling down to make sure that I've captured all of these questions. Actually, there's one we were going to raise because we've already had some questions this week, but I'll read directly the question that's just come through from Nathan. Says, Ben, what indications are unions giving to AMMA regarding their support or otherwise for WHS determinations in mandatory vaccinating, i.e. offshore employees, site-based employees, etc.?
We've had some reports from some of the unions' positions over here in Western Australia who have said that, to paraphrase, they're not going to cop no jab, no job. There's probably no surprises or no prizes for guessing which unions might have taken that position over here in WA. But that, I think, is a good indication that this is not likely going to be a kind of kumbaya moment with the union movement. We know that Christian Porter, is the Attorney General, is having some or plans to have some in-depth discussions with the ACTU and other stakeholders about this issue, about the vaccine and its relationship with workplaces. But certainly some of the information, some of the reports that we've had already is that unions are not on board with no jab, no job.
And in addition to unions, are there other stakeholders that we're seeing kind of comment on this, or in fact, you know, try and advise workforces around the position of no jab, no work?
Yeah, AMMA is doing quite a bit of policy work with other industry bodies around the country, and from those discussions, I think it's at this point in time, all industry bodies are quite strongly aligned around the approach of saying that, yes, when it comes down to it, employers will be able to direct that employees are vaccinated against COVID-19 in the right circumstances. But of course, there's still a ways to go yet, and some other things to play out before we really start to see that position tested in forums like the Fair Work Commission.
Thanks, Ben. And just a question from Tom. I'm just reading in the panel, so apologies, I haven't translated it into my notes yet. But he's raising the scenario about where employees in a company, the consideration of what happens if they refuse to work with a fellow employee that has not been vaccinated, and the implications for the development of, you know, policies in relation to that, or even just how they might deal with it, I think is a further question.
Yeah, I think quite an unusual scenario where people would consider that somebody who's not vaccinated poses a risk to them if they themselves have been vaccinated. But look, there probably will be scenarios that arise that draw a distinction between people who have been vaccinated and those who haven't in the workplace. I think that's the type of issue that employers need to factor into their assessment of the risks that attach to people's roles when forming a view as to whether or not it is an inherent requirement of somebody's role that they be vaccinated. And I think from this vantage point, after everything that everyone's been through in 2020, I think you'd be hard pressed to find many roles where you wouldn't be taking the position that it's sufficiently serious that people are vaccinated against, that would require someone to be vaccinated against COVID-19. I know the Australian government this week has commenced its own PR campaign to encourage people to be vaccinated. I think you're going to see a very, very strong push for a prolonged period of time that everybody go out and get vaccinated against COVID-19. And I think ultimately, by the end of this year, it's likely that you'll be dealing with the kind of intransigent number of people who just flat out refuse for unknown reasons to take the vaccine.
Right. There's a couple of questions that I want to get onto, but I want to ask this question that's come in earlier in this week, which is what kind of policy levers and contractual levers do employees have available to them when directing employees to be vaccinated?
So it's going to be very important that your organisation has a clear written position in relation to the vaccine and that you've communicated that to the workforce. There's a number of ways you can do that. You could create a standalone workplace policy in relation to the vaccine. You could include that particular position in your current COVID safe plan if that's something that's been communicated to your workforce, or you could include it in your existing fitness for work policy. It doesn't really matter where you put it, but I think it will be very important to have a clear written position in relation to the vaccine. And I think that written statement really just, at a high level, it needs to include these two very important sentences. The one, that the organisation strongly encourages all employees to be vaccinated against COVID-19, and two, that the organisation may require that an employee is vaccinated against COVID-19 if the employee is working in a role that the organisation deems to be high risk in relation to COVID-19. So that both that approach both encourages people and communicates that the organisation's position is that it is strongly encouraging people to take the vaccine, which is stopping short from saying it's no jab, no job, but at the same time reserving the right to direct people if you deem their role to be sufficiently high risk that it's a requirement of their role. So I think having a written policy in place that addresses those things is going to be quite important. There's a number of other things that you probably want to cover off as well in relation to kind of exceptions from those particular positions. But I think they're the key points that you'd want to be getting across. That's likely, I think, going to be something that should be housed in some form of workplace policy. Now, there's also the ability to put that into contracts of employment, but of course, realistically, you're only really going to be doing that with new employees to your organisation. You're not going to be able to go to your existing employees and unilaterally vary their contract or ask them to accept a variation to their contract that includes a vaccination obligation on their part. You'll just find that employees won't agree to that at all. So you can certainly update your employment contracts to cover that off, and that's probably the most robust way of doing it for new employees. But for your existing workforce, you're talking about putting in place a workplace policy or updating an existing workplace policy to cover off on those requirements.
And what about fitness for work policies? Will they need to be altered or addressed as well?
Yeah, that's most people would have something of that nature in place at the moment, and that could be a convenient place to include the organisation's position in relation to the vaccine if you didn't want to create some kind of a standalone policy that covered off on that.
Thanks, Ben. I'm just scanning a couple of these questions because I want to get to as many as possible. So apologies if I'm not looking at you while I'm doing it. In fact, it was Alice who posed that question before about somebody not wanting to work with a person working beside them that may not have been vaccinated. There was another question about do we expect that the efficacy of the vaccination in terms of the proof of its testing and its efficacy to be played back by employees as a reason not to be vaccinated and not for the company not to request that they be vaccinated or direct them to be vaccinated?
Yep, definitely. You will definitely have people say to you, I'm not taking it, it's only 60% effective anyway, and for that reason, how can you be sure that that's going to mitigate the risk? And frankly, my response to that is 60% is better than 0%. So go and take it.
And another couple of questions. Is there a mechanism to have the Fair Work Commission consider these issues beforehand?
There is, and it probably comes to the fore through your consultation requirements. So most people will probably find that introducing a new workplace policy or amending a workplace policy to address the vaccine question is going to require or going to trigger consultation requirements with the health and safety reps in the business. That may bring with it some union interaction. You'll pretty quickly get a sense as to whether or not those particular stakeholders are for or against the position that you're taking. And if they're against the position that you're taking, it's always open to the organisation to get on the front foot and use the dispute settlement procedure that they likely have access to if they've got an enterprise agreement in place, and get that into the Fair Work Commission for some assistance from the Commission if they want to go in that direction. Personally, I try to avoid the Fair Work Commission at all costs if I can. That may just be because I'm in WA, but I think that's certainly one way of getting some outside assistance if you're looking for that.
And thanks for that question, Peter. And thank you for all the comments and questions. Ben, we've got 2 minutes left and we've probably got about 3 questions. So I'm going to ask you to give me rapid fire answers if we can. I know it's not always possible. And then, of course, we'll be providing information. In fact, on that point, one of those 3 questions is what's AMMA doing to support its members in this area?
We're going to circulate to all of our members a kind of work guide to the vaccine issue that's going to include some of the information that we've talked about today, and also some, I suppose, some proposed wording you might like to consider for your own workplace policies and employment contracts. So expect to receive a copy of that in the near future.
Yeah, great. And I know that we're pulling out all stops to try and get it to everyone next week, but we are talking to a range of different stakeholders. So expect it soon. I know that some members are already providing us their policies in draft form for us to comment on, either from a policy perspective, but also to get Ben and his team and Katie and her team on the West and the East Coast to help them to ensure that they're in good shape. Okay, there's a really interesting question from Leanne, which says, what happens if we mandate or direct a person to take the vaccine and the person has side effects? That means that they're unable to work for a period of time.
I think I think that's certainly an issue that is going to see the person have access to personal leave. It may have some workers' compensation implications. There's probably nothing that can be done about that, given that you could not have foreseen that was going to be the case. But I strongly suspect that's going to eventuate in some form of workers' compensation claim.
Okay, another couple of quick ones is that when strongly recommending or making the vaccine mandatory particular people in your workforce, can employers ask employees to provide disclosure that they have been vaccinated? And if so, how should they request proof?
So if you are requiring somebody to be vaccinated, I think you're certainly in a position to also require that the person provide proof of having been vaccinated. That proof could take many different forms: medical certificate, receipt from the pharmacy where they had the injection, signing a stat dec. We have also heard talk of there being some kind of digital vaccination passport that may be introduced. I think the key is to make the provision of that evidence as easy as possible for the employee. A medical certificate might not be appropriate in all circumstances, but certainly if you're requiring that somebody be vaccinated, you should also be requiring that they provide proof that they've been vaccinated.
Ben, and I am getting a heap of questions, so we're not going to be able to get into all of it, but I know there is one implication that you in particular are talking to a lot of members about, which is for both the AstraZeneca and the Pfizer vaccine, it requires 2 doses, which is going to be quite challenging for our industry with rosters. Can you just quickly talk us through that issue and what it means for our industry?
Yeah, I think for our members, it's really important, which is the space between the 2 doses is not always going to work nicely with the roster arrangements that you have in place. So the 2-week gap between doses or the 3-week gap between doses, whichever vaccine is made available to your employees, is going to be problematic, or likely will be problematic if somebody is maybe on an 8 and 6 roster or is not working a roster that will see them on leave for up to 3 weeks at a time. And that's, I think, the majority of rosters in the resources industry look like that. So that is one thing that everyone needs to start thinking about now, is how are they going to potentially amend work schedules to ensure that people are able to go and get that second dose when they're required to take it, because the efficacy of the vaccine, as we understand it, hinges entirely on the taking of the second dose at the appropriate time. So it may be that rosters need to be changed to account for that, or other arrangements may need to be made in order to ensure that people can get that second dose on time.
Thanks, Ben, and we've just gone over time, so I'm going to stop you there. We've had some amazing questions in relation to pregnant employees. We've had a really great suggestion from Chloe about sharing this recording. Yes, we've recorded this webinar and we will make it available to AMMA members on request, so just pop us a line if you would like the recording, but we're going to include all the questions from today plus more in a Q&A section of the guide that we're providing. And we've had a lot of comments, people saying that they're looking forward to receiving that guide because it's clearly an area that we all need to work together on. So that brings us to a close. And certainly just over our allocated time. We knew that this was going to be a tough one, so we're probably going to do a few more webinars on this as more information from different stakeholders, different levels of government and different departments comes out, because like when COVID was the pandemic started, we really will do everything we can to keep you all up to date with every bit of information that we can gather on your behalf. So, and as always, our workplace advisors are here to help when it's really something specific to your business. So reach out, we're available to assist you. And thank you everyone, thank you for your time. I hope you have a lovely day and look forward to seeing you soon in another webinar, perhaps on the same topic, you never know. Thanks everyone. Thanks Ben.
Thanks Tara.